English isn't a language? Then what is? Okay, so English is a language. But bear with me, because in this video, I want to explain how English both is and isn't a language. Before I can do that, though, I have to explain what I mean by language. See, the thing is, in linguistics, it's not often we talk about languages as such. Especially in the wake of the past 50 or so years of sociolinguistics research, we as linguistic scientists have come to realize that languages don't really exist. Like if you ask a linguist what the difference is between a language and a dialect, they'll often quote an old quip popularized by the sociolinguist Max Weinreich: "A language is a dialect with an army and a navy." This quote is used to point out that there really isn't a meaningful difference between a language and a dialect. A good example of this are the 10 or so languages of Eastern China that are all usually called Chinese in English, even though a speaker of one language couldn't talk to a speaker of any other language. However, the thing is, these 10 or so languages all use the same writing system. Speakers of Min, for example, can't understand spoken Mandarin. However, written Mandarin is much easier to understand, provided the Min speaker can read. The fundamental difference between the Chinese writing system and most other writing systems is that the symbols in Chinese writing don't represent sounds. They don't really use an alphabet, and there are no letters. This is what makes it possible for different languages to use the same symbols. They aren't pronouncing them the same way, but they mean close enough things in the different languages that they can communicate using writing, even though they wouldn't be able to communicate by speaking. Check out Langfocus's videos on Chinese if you want to know more. The videos that Langfocus has out are great. An example of the opposite extreme are the Romance languages of Western Europe. While speakers of Chinese can't talk to each other, they can write to each other. That isn't the case for the speakers of the Ibero-Romance languages, for example. The languages of the Iberian Peninsula in Western Europe exhibit what linguists call a dialect continuum. What this means is that people tend to understand their neighboring villages fairly easily, but the further you get from your home village, the harder it is to understand people. It's not easy to draw a line between one village and another and say these speak different languages. The entire network acts like a chain, from one end to the other. In theory, you would be able to walk from Portugal at the edge of the Atlantic Ocean to Romania on the Black Sea and find this phenomenon. But actually, the dialect chain is broken in a couple of places. After centuries of migration, the territory that was once the Roman Empire has become host to other linguistic groups, and the Romance languages of this region have ceased to be spoken. However, the modern Romance languages of the Balkans and loanwords from Latin in the more recent linguistic arrivals are a testament to the extent and the influence of the Roman Empire. Getting back to the problem at hand, speakers of Galician and Portuguese can pretty easily understand each other, and speakers of Catalan can pretty easily understand Occitan speakers. And Catalan speakers and Portuguese speakers can generally understand Spanish speakers, but they can't understand each other, and it's often more difficult to understand the more geographically removed variant. This is compounded by the fact that their writing systems are different, so words that are pronounced the same in two languages might not be spelled the same way, because the different languages use different spelling conventions. This is what linguists describe as a dialect continuum, or a linkage. The term was introduced fairly recently, and even a lot of linguists aren't aware of the difference between a linkage and a family. This distinction was introduced by a linguist named Malcolm Ross pretty recently in the context of a science, about 30 years ago. The difference between a family and a linkage, according to Ross, is that a family arises when a language splits into isolated groups that develop separately from each other and do not form any kind of network. A linkage, on the other hand, tends to have complex and interweaving isoglosses, or boundaries between linguistic features. Take the dialects of English, for example. Northern British English is different from Southern British English in, among other things, that they contrast two fewer vowels in the north. The vowels in words like foot, strut, look, rub, could, and cub all have the same vowel. They don't distinguish those two vowel sounds as most other English speakers do, and they also don't distinguish the sounds in bath and trap. For them, trap, bath, bad, clasp, ham, and dance all have the same vowel. Now, this distinction actually varies a lot in the English-speaking world, especially in the US. But in southern England, there's a consistent distinction between the Bath words, including clasp and dance, and the trap words, including bad and ham. In the middle of the country, however, there's actually a mix, where some speakers distinguish Bath and trap vowels, but not the strut and foot vowels, and vice versa. The same thing happens in the Romance languages in Western Europe. The different dialects are distinguished by isoglosses that separate them. That's why some linguists argue that the Ibero-Romance languages are all dialects of the same language, because they form a linkage rather than a family. An example of this is the translation of the word castle. In the West, they're castelu and castellu, and in the East, they're castillo, castello, and castel. As you can tell, they're all pretty similar. It's just a few systematic differences that differentiate the dialects. For example, in the West, they tend to preserve the third syllable, whereas in the East, they tend to reduce the word to 2 syllables. This is a lot like the English example, except there are, quantitatively speaking, more dialects in the Ibero-Romance linkage than there are in English. A better analogy to English would be the Scots language, or better yet, the West Germanic languages. There's a series of similar isoglosses that separate the mountain varieties of German spoken in Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Italy, and Austria from those spoken in the lowlands of Germany and Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Denmark. So in any case, it's clear that when it comes to many of these isoglosses, they usually refer to specific linguistic features that are binary. That is, either you pronounce put or put the same, or you don't. Sometimes the isoglosses aren't binary though. For example, in North American English, the vowel in words like goat and boat are, generally speaking, gradually more fronted the further south and east you go. And the same goes for the vowel in mouth and crowd. Although it has a slightly different geographic pattern, the point remains. Some isoglosses are binary, while others are graded by some measure. The examples that I've given so far have been primarily on only dialects. Dialects behave this way because dialects are defined by geography. North American English includes dialects like New York City English, Vancouver English, and Oklahoma City English, each of which is in turn made up of individual idiolects. Idiolects are the competence that each individual has about their language. The problem here comes from the variation that's exhibited in a language. It's inevitable that there are words that people in your linguistic community use that you yourself do not use. For example, if your neighbor is a chef, they might know what the difference is between a meat cleaver and a vegetable cleaver, or a steak knife and a tomato knife. Or if your neighbor is a mechanic, they might know what a carburetor is, or what an OBD is, or what A, B, and C pillars are, or what a spark plug does. Whereas earlier waves of linguistics completely disregard this variation, more recent sociolinguistics has emphasized that variation is meaningful. Sociolinguists define social communalects, or sociolects, the same way that geolects, or geographic communities, are defined, in terms of their variation. Social variation, however, has proven a lot more difficult to understand than geospatial variation. So traditional sociolinguistics has primarily concerned itself with understanding the relationship between linguistic variation and social variation. Social variation in English exists, for example, in the so-called Mid-Atlantic accent, which is supposed to be a regionless, neutral accent between American and European English. Another example is the so-called gay accent, or gay lisp. This one is a bit different. Even though they're both used to express membership in a group, the Mid-Atlantic accent was meant to denote education and higher status, whereas the gay accent is sometimes mocked. And certainly, LGBT people around the world have a few civil rights to gain. So why would anyone want to overtly identify themselves as gay every time they open their mouth? Well, that's just the thing. Like the Mid-Atlantic accent, it's no one's native or only accent. That is to say, people switch in and out of it for purposes of identity construction. If you want to learn more about identity and culture, I recommend you watch these crash course videos. But the point is that often a person's idiolect is not entirely within one communalect, and they can weave in and out of different sociolects or geolects very naturally, and sometimes they even use them together. You might have heard of something called code switching. On some level, this is what that term refers to. So getting back to the question at hand, how is English not a language? Well, it is. But it's also so much more than a language. English is made up of the interweaving dialects that are native to mostly England, North America, Australia, and New Zealand. But English also refers to the social variation, the standards, the slang, the argots, and the jargon that have developed over the course of the history of the language. So yes, English is what you study in the classroom, but the varieties of English you speak at home or with your friends are just as valid, interesting, and worthy of study as the standard that's used in classrooms and formal events. And they are the reason that English is so much more than just a language. Anyway, so that's all for this video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the little bell button if you want to get notifications for when I post new videos. And check out the rewards I offer my patrons on Patreon. If you want me to dedicate an entire video to any language-related question you might have, or if you want access to my extra and behind-the-scenes content on my Patreon feed, check out the links below. Also, shout out to these patrons in particular. Thanks, you guys. These videos wouldn't be possible without you. And again, thanks for watching, everyone. This has been Jasid. Stay humble, stay curious, and I'll see you guys next time.